The Morning After, from The Magic Finger by Roald Dahl, illustrated by Quentin Blake, narrated by Miss Aggie
and Miss Lydia. When morning came, Mr. Gregg was the first to wake up. He opened his eyes. He was about to put out a hand for his watch to see the time, but his hand wouldn't come out.
That's funny. Where is my hand?
He lay still. Maybe he had hurt that hand. He tried the other hand. That wouldn't come out either. He sat up. Then, for the first time, he saw what he looked like. He gave a yell and jumped out of bed.
Mrs. Gregg woke up, and when she saw Mr. Gregg, she gave a yell too. He was now a tiny little man, maybe as tall as the seat of a chair, and his arms were a pair of duck's wings.
But, what's happened to you? Cried Mrs. Gregg.
What's happened to both of us, you mean? Shouted Mr. Gregg.
It was Mrs. Gregg's turn to jump out of bed. She ran to look at herself in the mirror, but she was not tall enough.
She was even smaller than Mr. Gregg, and she too had got wings instead of arms.
Oh, sobbed Mrs. Gregg.
This is witch's work, cried Mr. Gregg.
A minute later, Philip and William burst in. The same thing had happened to them. They had wings and no arms, and they were really tiny, as big as robins.
Mama, look, Mama, we can fly.
Come down at once. You are much too high, said Mrs. Gregg.
But before she could say another word, Philip and William had flown right out the window. Mr. and Mrs. Gregg ran to the window and looked out. The two tiny boys were now high up in the sky. Then Mrs. Gregg said to Mr. Gregg,
"Do you think we could do that, my dear?"
"Why not? Come on, let's try," said Mr. Gregg. Mr. Gregg began to flap his wings hard, and all at once, up he went. Then Mrs. Gregg did the same.
"Help! Save me!" she cried as she started going up.
"Come on, don't be afraid," said Mr. Gregg.
So out the window they flew, far up into the sky, and it did not take them long to catch up with Philip and William.
Soon the whole family was flying around and around together. Then William cried,
"Oh, isn't it lovely? I've always wanted to know what it feels like to be a bird."
"Your wings are not getting tired, are they, dear?" Mr. Gregg asked Mrs. Gregg.
"Not at all. I could go on forever," said Mrs. Gregg.
"Hey, look down there. Somebody's walking in our garden," said Philip.
They all looked down, and there below them, in their own garden, they saw 4 enormous wild ducks. The ducks were as big as men, and what is more, they had great long arms, like men, instead of wings. The ducks were walking in a line to the door of the Greggs' house, swinging their arms and holding their beaks high in the air.
"Stop! Go away! That's my house!" called the tiny Mr. Gregg.
The ducks looked up and quacked. The first one put out a hand and opened the door of the house and went in. The others went in after him. The door shut.
The Greggs flew down and sat on the wall near the door. Mrs. Gregg began to cry.
Oh dear, they've taken our house. What shall we do? We have no place to go."
"We will be eaten by cats and foxes in the night," said Philip.
"I want to sleep in my own bed," said William.
"Now then, crying won't help us. Shall I tell you what we're going to do?" said Mr. Gregg.
"What?" Mr. Gregg looked at them and smiled.
We are going to build a nest.
A nest? Can we do that?
We must do it. We've got to have somewhere to sleep. Follow me, said Mr. Gregg.
They flew off to a tall tree, and right at the top of it, Mr. Gregg chose the place for the nest.
Now we want sticks, lots and lots of little sticks. Off you go, all of you. Find them and bring them back here.
But we have no hands.
Then use your mouths, said Mr. Gregg.
Mrs. Gregg and the children flew off. Soon they were back, carrying sticks in their mouths. Mr. Gregg took the sticks and started to build the nest.
More, I want more and more and more sticks. Keep going.
The nest began to grow. Mr. Gregg was good at making the sticks stick together. After a while, he said,
That's enough sticks. Now I want leaves and feathers and things like that to make the inside nice and soft.
The building of the nest went on and on. It took a long time, but at last it was finished.
Try it, said Mr. Gregg. He was very pleased with his work.
Oh, isn't it lovely? I feel I might lay an egg any moment, said Mrs. Gregg.
The others all got in beside her.
How warm it is, said William.
And what fun to be living so high up. Nobody can hurt us up here, said Philip.
But what about food? We haven't had a thing to eat all day, said Mrs. Gregg.
That's right. So we will now fly back to the house and go in by an open window and get the tin of biscuits when the ducks aren't looking.
Oh, we will be pecked to bits by those dirty great ducks, cried Mrs. Gregg.
You shall be careful, my love, said Mr. Gregg, and off they went.
But when they got to the house, all the windows and doors were closed.
There was no way in.
Just look at those beastly ducks cooking at my stove. How dare she? Said Mrs. Gregg.
And look at that one holding my lovely gun, shouted Mr. Gregg.
One of them is lying in my bed, yelled William.
And one of them is playing with my electric train, cried Philip.
Oh dear, they have taken over our whole house. We shall never get it back. And what are we going to eat? Said Mrs. Gregg.
I will not eat worms. I would rather die, said Philip.
Or slugs, said William.
Mrs. Gregg took the two boys under her wings and hugged them.
Don't worry, I can mince it all up very fine, and you won't even know the difference. Lovely slug burgers, delicious worm burgers.
Oh no, cried William.
Never,
said Philip. Disgusting. Just because we have wings, we don't have to eat bird food. We shall eat apples instead. Our trees are full of them. Come on, said Mr. Gregg.
So they flew off to an apple tree. But to eat an apple without holding it in your hands is not at all easy. Every time you try to get your teeth into it, it just pushes away. In the end, they were able to get a few small bites each, and then it began to get dark. So they all flew back to the nest and lay down to sleep.
It must have been at about this time that I, back in my own house, picked up the telephone and tried to call Philip. I wanted to see if the family was all right.
Hello?
Quack,
Who is it?
quack, quack,
Philip, is that you?
quack, 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 quack.
Oh, stop it!
Quack, 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 quack.
Oh, that magic finger. What has it done to my friends?
That night, while the Greggs were trying to get some sleep in the nest, a great wind began to blow. The tree rocked from side to side, and everyone, even Mr. Gregg, was afraid that the nest would fall down.
Then came the rain. It rained and rained, and the water ran into the nest, and they all got as wet as could be. Oh, it was a bad night.